While in Scandinavia, the 3 Nobel Prize winners will get their prize, we're going to think about the importance of their work. And as an economist, I'm going to stress indeed the economic perspective. But I think it's a topic that appeals to all of us. The English title of the main book indeed is Why Nations Fail. And that's maybe the question we have all the time. What creates stability in the world? What creates instability? And typically we see countries that are unstable and not very much of an economic success keep to be a threat to the world, peace and so on. And this continues forever. And that's actually also the theme of the work by the Nobel Prize winner. So I think it's a very topical thing. Let's introduce you to the 3 winners first. So here is the official portrait of the 3 winners. And the Nobel Prize, it's actually indeed not the real Nobel Prize, because the real Nobel Prize is not a thing that is awarded by the Central Bank of Sweden. And that's the case for the Nobel Prize in Economics. It's invented to make sure that economics get equally treated as the other sciences, I think. But it has enough prestige to take this prize serious. And indeed, all winners, previous winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics are real scientists and have brought, I think, insightful insights. So typically, the prize will be granted for a single idea or a single contribution that the winner or the winners have. And in this case, so you should be able to summarize it in just a few words. So here it is for studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. So it is about institutions. So let me quickly explain what this means. It means how society is organized. That's the shortest summary. It's not just that we have a central bank or that we have a government. No, it is how government is organized, how political life is organized, or even how we deal with each other. Social norms can be part of institutions. So it's a very broad concept, but it's all about how we organize society, how we set the rules of the game, how we sign contracts. And we're going to talk a lot about what institutions mean in their view, but it comes down to, well, what kind of society do we live in? What kind of economic rules do we have? And what kind of political rules are we subject to? So that's the first word. The second word is how they are formed. So institutions don't come out of the blue. The fact that we in the Netherlands have this so-called polder model, the fact that we debate about everything and then take decisions, that used to be our way of the rules of the game, right? That maybe has roots in history. It is formed at some point in time, and once we have it, apparently it was beneficial to us, or apparently we couldn't get rid of it, and we still have it. But it's important to know why we have it and the Belgians don't have it, right? Because only then we can explain the world. So that's an important part, how they are formed. And finally, it is about how this affects prosperity. So it can explain why some nations are rich and some other nations are poor. So it affects prosperity because if you organize your society in a good way, then maybe it's easy to start a firm, or it's easy to expand your investment abroad, and this is good for the economy. And it depends a lot on how the economic and political rules are. And that's the main theme of their work. So that's in a nutshell what's going to be. So let's take a first glance at how prosperity in the world is lined up. So the darker the color, the richer the country. And here, richness is measured by per capita income. So you just calculate what on average a person earns in money terms. And you make sure you can compare €1 to $1, right? You use the right exchange rate, and you even correct for the fact that maybe haircuts in some countries are cheaper than in other countries, right? So you correct and you try to measure what is the real purchasing power in different countries. So what do you see? Okay, some prominent black countries, the US is considered to be the country with the highest income per capita, right? But typically, if you look where the poor countries are, it's clear where they are, right? So you would say it's Africa, but there is another pattern. The closer you are to the equator, the poorer you are. So we found the explanation, right? Good. So we have a very difficult question: why are countries rich or poor? Well, the answer is, don't get close to the equator, because then you get poor. Yeah. So this was actually the state of science before the Nobel Prize. In the 18th century, they tried to find out why countries are rich or poor, and they said, well, it's geography. It's clear, right? Of course, this is a bit of a joke, because this picture is a recent picture, and you have to go back in time. It turns out that if you go back in time, differences between countries were way smaller, right? But still, you see this pattern. So the usual suspects, the usual explanations for explaining why some countries are rich or some countries are poor is geography. But the second one could be culture. It could be, in the US, the rich country in the world, there is these Calvinists, people with Calvinist roots. They come from England, even from Delfshaven in the Netherlands, right? They started their country. They had a culture of hard work and saving a lot. No wonder they got rich. Yeah? So that's another explanation. Well, it could be. We have to check, right? So that's why we have science, find out what is. The third explanation mentioned, at least in the book, is that, we didn't know. It's a very complex thing. We don't know how to get rich as a country as a whole, right? Yes? If you know how to play the piano and become a concert pianist, yes, that could be a way. But in general, it's a very complex thing to make a country rich or start from scratch. So that's maybe ignorance. Well, all these three explanations are discarded by the Nobel Prize winners. They say all these explanations are rubbish. Yeah, it's an American team. Well, it's not an American team. It's Acemoglu is from Turkey, one American, and there is one British Nobel Prize winner. But it's if you read the book, it's very straight, right? It's, this is our message, all the others are wrong. You could also say this is a selling way of selling. You could also say this is the sociology of science. You find your results, and now you try to find the best arguments to sell your results. So what you need to do is to point out that the geography explanation is not a good explanation. Yeah? And we already know, it's only a correlation. Maybe it's by coincidence that the poor countries are located at the equator. We need to find a mechanism. We need to find a reason why being close to the equator makes you poor. So it could be diseases close to the equator, or it's too hot to work, right? These kinds of things. But then you need to test this, right? So what is the explanations that Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson put forward? Well, we know already this is institutions. It's the way society is organized. So they should claim, if you want to explain the picture before, you should explain why the US and Canada have different institutions than sub-Saharan Africa. Is it different ways society is organized? And they use a lot of statistics. So if you read the book, and I brought the book, maybe you have the book on your own shelf. So it's a thick book, and it's good reading, but there is not a single smell of science in the sense that you don't see these graphs. But here is maybe a graph that should help you to explain what's happening. So on the horizontal axis, you see, let me see if I can use the pointer. You see a latitude, that means distance from the equator. So you're far away if you're in the UK, but you're close to the equator if you're in Congo, right? and the vertical axis has per capita income, so average income in your country. So the rich countries are way up, the poor countries are down the figure. And indeed, the more the left you are in the picture, the closer you are to the equator, and there is many countries that are poor. But nothing tells you about the explanation why they are poor. Maybe there is another explanation, and there is many geography explanations. One of them could be access to the sea. And that makes a lot more sense in economic terms, because that could mean if you have access to the sea, in the old days you needed the sea to transport your goods, so trade was basically only possible if you have access to the sea. And there is a bit of correlation here, so if you have more access to the sea, you have higher per capita income. But again, this is just a correlation, it doesn't say much about what's actually happening. What can we say about culture? So this is kind of their caricature of the geography explanation, it's only correlation. What can we say about culture? Well, one natural experiment would be to compare different migrants in, let's say, New York City. They have a Chinese background, an African background, a European background, right? They typically bring their own culture. That's the definition of culture. It's how you personally treat the other people, right? And how do you trust other people? So what you see indeed, the Chinese save a lot. They work hard, right? Maybe the Calvinists as well, right? So they bring their own culture, and you see differences between different migrants to a city. But what typically happens is that after 2 or 3 generations, the cultural differences are gone. That means the first generation brings the initial culture, but apparently there is no judgment about this. This is what we see as a positive fact, as something that happens. Apparently, the country in which you live is going to form you in terms of culture. So it's not that culture makes the country rich, but it's more the other way around. You get into a country, and your kids or your grandchildren get used to the culture of that country. And then the question again is, where does the culture come from? Apparently, there is something else that comes first and that shapes the culture. Culture is not an independent explanation, it's something that comes from something else that's probably more important. So culture is not a satisfying explanation, we need to find something behind culture. Now, this is one country in the world that you might recognize. Well, it's written there, North Korea, South Korea, and it visualizes this geography and culture thing in one very clear picture. This is a relatively small country. It is a homogeneous country in terms of culture. So all people in this country have kind of the similar culture. All people live in similar geographical conditions, and yet there is an enormous difference. And the difference here is visualized by using satellites. It is a satellite picture. You see the lights that are burning in the cities and in the towns. And in the south there is lots of lights, in the north there is hardly any lights, and this is our best measure of local wealth. So of course we can use average income, that's not a good income, not a good measure. It's better to know where wealth is. The more light burns in the streets, the richer the area is, the neighborhood is. So you can use satellite data to see very precisely, even in countries of which we don't know much because there is no statistics about North Korea, no reliable statistics. We see immediately that there is an enormous difference between North Korea and South Korea. And the claim of the book is that this must be the result of institutions. The fact that the North is communist and the South is democratic and capitalistic. So the book, or the work by the 3 winners, is the Nobel Prize laureates, is mainly about how can it be that a country like North Korea adopted another organization of its society that was detrimental to the economy. What came first? What triggered these institutions? And this can be a simple historical event like a war, like in Korea, but of course we need to find the pattern for the world as a whole. And the key argument of the laureates is that political institutions come first, and they in the end shape the economic conditions. And that's quite special for a Nobel Prize winner in economics, because typically we downplay the role of institutions and downplay the role of politics. It's more like, you know, if you want to have a market, good, convince the politicians to liberalize markets or regulate markets or whatever. So there is not so much talk about political institutions, but in the work of these laureates there is a lot. Maybe you might think back of your philosophy classes, or then you might think, this is the opposite of what Marx said, right? Marx said something like, it's the economy that determines everything and that determines in the end the ideology. This book is the upside down of this idea. So the one thing is that political institutions are very important. The other thing is that still it's not like once you know what the politics in the country is, you know what's going to happen to the country. No, some people can switch, can have a change. So at some point there is a window of opportunity to change the rules of the game, to have a revolt and people change regime or whatever. And in that sense, it's not all predetermined. There is some kind of free will or windows of opportunity. I think that's the main idea here. So let's think a bit more about what these mysterious institutions are. They are very clear, and maybe it's a very American view again. Institutions are better if property rights are better protected. So if you start a firm, and you know you can be sure that if you earn more in your firm, you can have a higher, better way of living. There is not a village owner that says you have to pay higher taxes if you earn more, or you have to give me some part of your revenue. If that's the case, then we say property rights are well protected. So that also means people can hold land and can start a farm, or they can buy land and buy a factory. They can write contracts. They know if they wrote a contract with another party, then it will be honored. This is all property rights. And that's a key, essential part of good economic institutions. If you organize these things well, that property rights are protected, this is a guarantee for prosperity in your country, according to the book. The other thing is, a bit of jargon, this is what we call distortion. So in principle, a market is a good thing because the buyer can say whether she wants to buy the good or not, and the seller has the same position. It's a voluntary exchange of goods. So if you organize markets that are not regulated too much, buyers and sellers come together and they together determine whether there is a mutual gain from trade. So in that sense, markets are good for both sellers and buyers, and that makes economists typically think that the fewer free enterprise and market exchange is restricted, the better for the economy is. So you should not have a government that sets rent controls or set price controls or prevents wage increases. That should not be done according to this definition of distortions. Then you would have a distortion. Right? So that's for the good institutions. What would be concrete examples? How can we measure? Because ideally we want to know whether in different countries markets are treated differently, right? Now that's a problem, because now put yourself in the shoes of a scientist. You have this idea, it's kind of obvious maybe, that if you can start your firm, then probably it's good for the economy, right? But you need to know, what is the difference between Congo and Angola in terms of property rights? Well, and here there is a key contribution of these laureates. They found a way to measure these things across different countries. And the good thing is that they thought, well, firms are investing all over the world, all the time. They need to know how risky it is to invest in different countries. So there is lots of consultancy firms that give firms information about how risky it is in different countries. So there is lots of very detailed data about expropriation risk or investment risk or whatever, country risk in general. right? So using this commercial data, we can get a very detailed picture of how good property rights are protected in different countries. The other thing is about political institutions. We want to have, at the political side, a system in which it's not an autocracy. There is different, well, the power is not in the hand of one person who can just privilege his friends in the economy, but everybody has access to the economy. That should mean that, that there is diffusion of power in society. And that's another thing that we can measure. There is political data about how to characterize the political system of countries. And that brings us to the book. So I already showed the English book. The Dutch book has a slightly different title, but maybe even more interesting, right? So the Dutch book says why some countries are rich and others are poor. The English version more talks about power and failure of the political system. I think it's great reading. There is a lot of, if you like history, if you like economics, there is a lot of nice anecdotes about this. And then it ties everything together under the heading of this idea that institutions determine everything. You should protect property rights, and you should have checks and balances in the political system. Well, some people, and that's always the case with Nobel Prize, they say, this is not science, it's just an idea. It's look at the book. So is this the book that they got the Nobel Prize for? So there is many popular science books anyway, right? I think that's a bit of a misperception of the Nobel Prize. It's not the book, it's the scientific work that's behind the book, and it's just a service to us that they translated this in this very readable book. We don't need to go to the journal article. So what did they do in science contribution? The use of data is new, so we already saw the example of the satellite data. It's not just them doing this, but this illustrates the fact that we can see on a very thin scale, fine scale, what is really income. They go to archives, so we can find out how many enslaved people are transported in boats every year, every different routes. They go to historical archives. We know, for instance, all graduates from German universities since the year 1300 or so, and we can use this to see what is the effect on job. Well, this kind of data, that's at the back of this. That's first. Second is not just the data, but is how you treat the data, how you infer things from the data. And the key thing is that we should not just think about correlation, that rich countries are typically far away from the equator, but we should think about what is behind this. And this is typically easy when you just do an experiment in the lab. You control things and you change the amount of water that you give to a plant and you see it's growing faster. That's easy, and you do this in other laboratory settings. But how can you transform this into a country setting? How can you prove that better institutions in a country have led to more income the next 20 years? That's way more difficult to find. And they contributed to this, and we will see some examples. And finally, they moved economics a bit away from this market thinking by also bringing on board institutions, the rules of the game, and be very nuanced about this, and the link to politics. So let's just take one example. I think one of the most famous papers they wrote, actually it's also written by the three of them, so the book is only by the two of them, but and it's about colonization. It's taking differences in current income, richness, differences across countries nowadays, and links it back to colonial times and see if there is a connection. So here is a map, and you see typically that it's very diverse. If Africa, very different colonizers were active, it was split among different countries, but they all had their own way of dealing with the countries, and in particular, they organized these countries in a different way. And the key argument of this article published in 2001 says that when the Western European countries went to Africa, they colonized in two, broadly speaking, two different strategies. Either they created a new Europe. Think of the US. When they came to the US, they copied there. They built New Amsterdam, and New Amsterdam looked like Amsterdam, right? Even the streets looked the same, right? That was completely different from what we as Dutch people did in Indonesia, where the second strategy was applied. We bribed the local rulers. We didn't go into the mainland of Indonesia. We just bribed the local rulers and asked them to ship many of the resources and be able to sell this in the Netherlands. And this is what we call extractive institutions. So while the neo-Europes like Australia and the US copied the European structure into a system with police, with land ownership, with firms that could start, the other strategy is about extraction. You try to move as much resources out of the colonies into the main, back into Europe. And guess what? The countries that got the neo-European institutions are rich today, and the Indonesians and other African countries that got the extractive institutions are still poor today. So they claim that there is a link between colonialism in the old days and current prosperity nowadays. But it's more than that. Because it's not just that all African countries, all poor countries have had this poor colonization strategy. There's countries in Africa that never were colonized. And still, you can check what were their institutions. And if they got the wrong institutions, they are still poor. That's going to be the main argument. So we need to find out, why is it that some countries got the extractive institutions, like Indonesia? Why did the US got the good institutions? That's the real question. The real question is not why is the US rich? No, why did it get the right institutions? Here's the answer. So, if you wanted to go to a faraway country as a European settler, you run the risk of not being, well, maybe the climate is simply making it impossible for you to live there. And one main reason could be malaria. We cannot stand malaria. So typically countries that suffered from incidents of malaria were inhabitable for European settlers, so they would never go there and find their own villages and towns. They rather bribed the local rulers and made sure they could ship all the resources. On the other hand, it was easy to settle in South America or North America. There was no malaria, so they could start their own, they started living there. And once you start living there, you'd like to have the same institutions, the same rule of law, the same police force, and so on, as in your own country. How do we know this? So, because again, you need to find out exactly what was the effect of malaria at the time, or other diseases. And now we need to find the right data. And this is the beauty of this paper, because that's why I have the second picture. Who knows the artist who made this second picture at the right? I'm Dutch, so I'm proud of our artists. Escher, yes. So it's not the typical Escher like the mirrored things, but it's an old Escher print. So I think what you see is a dead bishop. And this is the key. Maybe the laureates saw this picture because they thought, you know, we need to find out how costly it is to get to live in a foreign country. So let's think of people who are sent out to other countries, maybe merchants, maybe military forces, maybe traders, maybe bishops. Every country needs bishops. Right? If you're going to colonize another country, you're going to send bishops. So if we know how many bishops died in one country as compared to another country, we know exactly how easy it is for people to survive. So go to the archives in the Vatican maybe, and look up the numbers, because I'm sure the Pope knows exactly, wants exactly to list how many bishops died in the new regions. So this is an example of very detailed data. You had to go to the archives, you had to convince the Pope to get the data, and then you have a very year by year, region by region list of how lethal it is to go to a colony. And then you can do your data. And here I'm going to be a bit technical, but I think it illustrates what the amount of work you do and the science behind the book. So we start with knowing how many bishops died. That's called settler mortality. So, and the claim is that if many of them die, so it's apparently inhospitable in this country to live, and then there will be few people, few European living in the country, that means you expect extractive institutions rather than neo-European institutions. But that's only history. The claim is that this happened in the past but persists nowadays. And that's essentially in their story. What happened in the past, you get stuck with the wrong institutions. This persists. So they need to find in the data that if in the 16th century bishops died, then currently in the 20th century, the 21st century, we still see extractive institutions. And then, of course, the final step is to find out if wrong institutions indeed lead to low per capita income, low income. Yeah? So in an econometrics design, mortality because of malaria or other things is going to affect institutions, is going to change the way society is organized, and therefore a country is doing well or poorly in terms of economic performance. And by the way, it's clear that, sorry for the shift, it's clear that mortality has no direct effect on current performance. Why is this? So think of malaria. You might say, okay, if the people in a country suffer from malaria, it's not only the bishop that die, but also the people. No. They are adapted to malaria, right? They are immune to so there is no direct effect. It must run through institutions. Yeah? So this is the data they use. Maybe this is a picture. Let me allow me to use one picture. So what we see here is that this is how many bishops died in the 15th century. This is how per capita income is in 1995. So there is a link between historical settler mortality and current GDP. Well, I think this is beautiful, right? It explains everything. There is a great story. There is detailed data. This is why you get the Nobel Prize. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to give more details. Of course, there is many steps, right? So you have to follow the steps first to show that bishops link to old institutions, new institutions, and so on. So this makes the book and the work, I think, very interesting. There is many cases of this, and it links to history. What happened in history? So let me give you some examples, and the beautiful thing is that history repeats itself, so you see this pattern many times, and that's why the book is so readable. So first, you see often that there is a resource curse. So countries that start out rich don't benefit from this. Think about Africa, a very rich continent, in the end it ends up poor. South America, very rich, it was silver, gold. It didn't make it to the high income levels like North America, which was a poor continent. The other thing is, political institutions typically are linked to who can vote, who can participate in the political process, where is democracy, who has a parliament. The birth of parliament is a key change in the political institutions everywhere. So ideally we want to explain where Parliament is going to be the main parliamentary system, is going to be the main political institution. Another thing is, if we see an autocratic regime, it typically persists. So think of Russia, it always has a history of strong rulers, it still is now the case. Democracy was early already in the low countries, it still is here, so it's very persistent. So that's another thing we want to explain. So let's dive a bit into this persistent hypothesis. So here's a claim that they make. typically current differences in economic performance go back to, well, to historical events that are very persistent. Examples are the Roman Empire. If you would map the current main roads in Europe, and you would put a map of the Roman roads 2,000 years ago, there is a very strong overlap. So trade routes in the past are very much correlated. So this is this persistence, right? I already gave the other examples. Let's think about North and South America. So as I said, South America is the rich continent. It had gold and silver and lands. North America was kind of an afterthought, right? So if the English had to find a colony, they were a bit late. Portugal and Spain were first to get the rich countries. The North American was left for the Dutch and the English. It was a very poor country, right? So Spain and Portugal were very happy. They had the silver and the gold. But in the end, it didn't work out. And the book gives an excellent explanation here, because it pays off to create extractive institutions in South America, because there is lots of revenue. The society is already very rich. It's well organized. You just need to bribe the local rulers. And then you get all the gold and silver to Spain. What about North America? Well, there is nothing. There's lots of land, but it's a very poor continent. So the only thing the English could do is send their own farmers, promise them some land, gave them property rights over the land, let them start a firm, and convince them to work hard so that they would, well, start their own living. But that exactly meant that they created the European institutions with property rights, with rule of law, with signing contracts, the opposite of the extractive institutions. And that means, while initially North America was the poor continent, they got this shock, this historical coincidence that the English were late and wanted to colonize. Therefore, they got the good institutions, which there was an economic reason for this, right? We just explained. And that meant the US became the rich country in the world. So there is a reversal of fortune. Initially, it was poor. Now it became rich. So now we have two ideas. On the one hand, we have persistence. So often things have a long shadow. The history has a long shadow. But also sometimes we see suddenly a reversal of fortune. Another example is Argentina. It was very rich even in the 19th century, but at some point it left behind. Venice was the superpower of the 13th century. It was in the middle of the trade between China and Europe and the Crusades. Now it's just a museum city. How can this be? Big reversal of fortune. We already talked about America. Historians have formulated a law, and we like laws because that looks like sign. It says Courtwell's law. It says that every region that at some point was the leader in the area gets into some ossification and becomes the backward, will be overtaken by somebody else. Let me skip these things for sake of time. Let me give, I didn't translate this part. Let me give one other example in which we see the persistence of history. So in Bolivia and Peru, there is lots of gold to be mined. How do you organize this? Also, the local authorities already thought about, and the Spanish occupier thought about how to organize this. And an example of an extractive institution is just forced labor. So in Dutch, dwangarbeid, right? You just want to force your workers to go to the mines. But of course, this only works in regions in which you're close to the mine. So here is a map. And you see the black area is the region in which the Spanish system said, okay, these villages are close enough to the mine, so we require 1 out of every 7 men to be working in the mine. It's just forced labor. Well, that's a very detrimental way of organizing your economy, because you don't have freedom to start the business that you're good at, and well, this is not a good way to organize your economy. So if we see this system in the 16th century, we still see that regions that were subject to forced labor in that time are still poor now. So we see this persistent. And again, here there is used very detailed data about this. Another example of the shock in history is the Black Death in Europe. You remember in COVID time, everybody went back to Black Death stories because 1/3 of population died because of the Black Death. That was in the 14th century. What is the effect on politics and the economy and institutions? Well, in Europe, in Western Europe, labor all of a sudden got more power because there's less farmers, so lots of land. Farmers were needed to work on the lands. Typically, they were in serfdom, so they had to work for the feudal lords. But now they could revolt, and they could say, you know, I want to have higher wages, I want to have my own plot of land, and because of the low numbers and the scarcity of labor, they got this. So in Western Europe, this was a shock that was very good for institutions, because all of a sudden, workers got more rights and more access to economic activity. However, it's not how history works. It's not that you can always completely predict what happens. Things depend on very small eventualities. In Eastern Europe, exactly the opposite. Also there, 1/3 of population changed, but for some reason, the feudal lords were much better organized, and they could actually repress more the farmers, because they said, oh, you're in such a miserable condition now, you lost all your family, okay, I'm going to help you, but I'm going to tighten the rules. So what we see is in the medieval time a divide between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, more serfdom in Eastern Europe and poorer institutions in Eastern Europe, better institutions in Western Europe. There is other critical events in the economy like war, like the naval power of England that came because they defeated the Spanish fleet. We even have stories about Dutch princes going to England and strengthening Parliament, the Glorious Revolution. This was, in the eyes of the Nobel Prize winners, a good thing because institutions became better, there was more diffusion of power. So the lesson then is the reversal of power is important. Typically, if you start rich, so that's the upper line, and you don't start to introduce the good institutions, then you stay poor. If you start poor in the lower line, and for some reason you get better institutions, then you can overtake the poor, the other country. Now, I think all these stories are nice to read, but at some point you want to see the big picture again. So how can it be? It's a bit contradictory, right? On the one hand, they tell a story about persistence. If it's bad in the past, it's always bad. But on the other hand, they tell this story about, at some point you get a reversal of fortune. How can we link this together? So ideally we want to have a theory, and we want to explain why some countries have the good institutions, the inclusive institutions, and some countries have the bad institutions, and especially when do they arise and when can you switch from the bad to the good ones. And maybe I should mention one category. It's not only good inclusive institutions and poor extractive institutions. You can also think about, well, what's the role of centralization of power? Is it always good or always bad? No, it depends. If you have a very strong state that has very much power to change things, in a way it's good. Yeah? But if they use this power to just enrich a small elite, of course it's not going to be good for the economy. So you ideally want to have a centralized, powerful state that is subject to checks and balances. For instance, a parliament or other rules of law that limits the power of the executive. And here is the theory, and it's not in the book, but I think it explains a bit of how things work. So who can guess what this picture is? Well, the circles are balls. Think of this as a hill or mountain, and the ball in the middle is staying there, it's staying put, it will not change, right? The other two balls are going to the extremes, so to speak. So suppose you're at the right. That's the right side or the bad side? Well, I think left is the best side, but okay, the right is the right side. Let's think of the right ball, right? This is the metaphor of an economy that already has good institutions, and this reinforces each other. So if you have good institutions, many firms can be started, people have good ideas, they convince others, it's inclusive, everybody has access to the power, so you get better and better. That's the right-hand side. The left-hand side is the case in which you start with the wrong situation, lots of corruption. You need to go to the person in power, and he has to be in a good mood for you to be able to start your firm. But that's gonna things only get worse. Yeah, so that's why you move to the other extreme. Now, this explains why, if you're already at the corners, it's very hard to push the ball again to the other side. Yeah? So this is the metaphor from that you're locked in, as it's called. The other example is, if you start in the middle, it could be that Eastern Europe moves to the wrong side with a very small push, and Western Europe, in which the plague also hits, with a very small push, moves to the right side. So in this way, this small mole is a metaphor of how things can change, and once you have changed, that it's very difficult to change back again. So here in words, suppose you have a poor institution, you're with the wrong institutions. That means you are in a failing nation. Remind the title, Why Nations Fail. You get a revolt. Okay, that means a new group comes in power, but of course they are going to use the old institutions. They know how to expropriate the firms that they don't like, and they're going to enrich themselves. And again, it will be this very extractive situation. Sorry for the Dutch here. So they will fail again. That shows that once you go in the wrong direction, it's going to stay in the wrong direction. In the good situation, it's the other way around. There is checks and balances. So in the first place, bad ideas get very little chance anyway, because they will quickly be replaced by good ideas. And maybe this is a bit of too optimistic American view of life, but this is the theory, and this is what they find in the data. So let's see if we see some of these lessons in the world today. So here's the checklist. How can we find out whether a country is on the good path or the bad path? Well, according to the laureates, we should think about, is power concentrated? If so, it's bad. If there is checks and balances, it's good. And is power inclusive? Is there, for many groups in society, access to power, and do they get rights? Yeah? What about the economy? Property rights should be secure, and you should have any person in society should have access to economic opportunity. That means jobs, no discrimination, training, education, credit, banks should be developed, and there should be access to innovation. Well, first example, China. It's the superpower in the world. We all are afraid of China, not the Nobel Prize laureates. They are very critical of China. Why? It's autocratic. There's only one person who has all the power, and there is little checks of balances, at least if this is the right picture of how politics in China works. And I'm only quoting the book. I'm not saying that maybe there is a different view, right? The other view is that the Chinese party works very different. It's actually many, many layers. There's lots of communication between different... And some other people say, you know, the party has no power at all. It's all the family that matters and personal... So maybe, but this is at least the book, right? Why doesn't China score well in the book? There is no property rights. All land is leased from the government, from the state. Nobody has private property rights. Another example, USA, right? How stable is power in the USA? Are we on the top of the hill and we only need a small push to get to the wrong side? What about access to opportunity? How equal is access to opportunity in the US? Well, the funny thing, the remarkable thing is that they don't claim much about the US. I think they want to be sure of their comfortable position in US economies, and they don't say much about politics. And this was a bit of a disappointment to European researchers, including our colleague Theo van der Klundert, who always complained that the Americans never say something critical about the American politics. Okay, but let's not blame this. Maybe the event of 2 days ago. What can we predict of what happens in Syria today? Well, the iron law of autocracy says you replace one autocrat by another autocrat. If the institutions are poor, it's hard to overturn them. So according to this book, the prospects for Syria are not very good, because probably it will be a chaos very soon again, and the same institutions will be used to oppress other groups in society, maybe. Well, that's not a very nice conclusion, but still, I think I'm going to conclude. And the conclusion is, please read the book. It's very good reading if you like history, if you like economics. You will find out that economics is complex, and history is even more complex, but I think the more fun it is. So thank you for listening.
We have time, a few minutes for some questions, and I will take the microphone.
Hi.
So, there.
Thank you. Nikos here. Thank you for the very clear presentation and translation of the findings from the research. My question is do the authors offer any hope to poor countries if what you need is good institutions, but they don't have that, and bad institutions are sticky, they're really hard to change? So how do you get out of this cycle?
Yeah, so there is a few good messages. I think, first of all, don't think anymore of the ignorance hypothesis. So don't claim that we don't know how to improve the economy or how to improve economic life. They claim we know what is in principle good for them, but it's hard to get the right institutions and to implement the right economic policies because things are sticky. So the next message is that there is always some critical junctures, as they call them, some windows of opportunities. Then all of a sudden there is a revolt, and maybe if you grasp the opportunity, if you get support maybe from the rest of the world, this should be the time to change things. And they show many examples in which they succeeded. So in a way, that could be the hopeful message. But I think maybe my personal translation would be, we need to unite, the different countries and to support. And of course, we know this is too difficult, right? It's very difficult. And I know Acemoglu has written with Johnson another book that goes more into these details, but I cannot give the details here now.
Yes. Okay. What's the title of that book?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. What is the title? I forgot.
Okay. We will find out.
We'll find out, yeah.
Okay, thank you for the lecture. So I have a
The
question.
small road, something like the small road to something. So it already illustrates it is possible, but it's difficult and you need to grasp the opportunity. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, it's okay. Is that I have noticed that the authors offered a very convincing analysis through the history of European colonization, but they didn't actually think about the spread of communism in that regard, because I would argue that the political institutions in Russia, in China, in North Korea are pretty bad. So, and I was wondering, because those countries are not like the destinies or aim or goal of European settlers, not in a history, or at least not in a very long time. So I was wondering, so you said that there is the factor of persistence of the bad institutions. So what drives those countries to accept or establish the very stable bad institutions, even without the history of colonization? And when thinking back of your pictures on page 46, you said there's a ball in the middle and two different ways that the balls can go. But is the slopes like symmetric on both sides? Is there like an initial condition that prompts the ball to more inclined to fall right or the left? So that is my first question.
Yeah. So of course we should not take too literally this picture. It's just a way of illustrating things. And the key thing is that there is reinforcing mechanisms. So once you have unequal access to economic opportunity, you automatically get that the current leaders, that people who are privileged, can reinforce their position because they can misuse their power to oppress the rest, and they only get more power. And if there is a revolt, the new group automatically takes over the habits and the investments of the other group. In that sense, there is a reinforcing thing, and that means that, well, this picture of if you go one direction, it's only get reinforced. How exactly you reinforce things, that's not so clear, right? And maybe it's also not so much a mountain in which you are, but maybe a gulf in the sea, right? Think of what happened in the 15th century, 16th century. All of a sudden we found out that it's good to go on the ocean, find other countries. Well, good, I mean, this was good for the economy of Western Europe. So the naval, innovations came. All of a sudden, Western Europe was in a much better position than, for instance, inland Romania, right? Because access to the Atlantic all of a sudden was more important than being maybe in a resource-rich country. So that means there is a small invention of more reliable shipping and naval routes, that shifts the position, whether you're to the left or the right of the hill. And that's what different papers and different researchers try to find out. Can we identify the shock that all of a sudden puts people or countries on the other side of the hill? And what is the reinforcing mechanisms? Because also with the access to the Atlantic, once you start trading, you have an incentive to get more privileges with the king, and the king only gets more tax revenue if it allows the merchants to go out on the seas, and so this reinforces the demand for more diffuse power. It pays for the king to give up a little bit of power in return for more tax revenue that is earned by going on the sea. These kind of mechanisms are then detailed out in these researches.
Okay, one very small question from you, and then the last question over there. Okay.
Sorry, I have to ask a second one. Okay, so I was reading an article that, if I remember correctly, another Nobel Prize laureate, Mr. Stiglitz, mentioned something in one of his articles, said that, okay, I see there's a massive issues with Chinese economy, and one of the most important things is that the government invested too much in infrastructure, not in the people's welfare. So he got this suggestion, okay, so government should raise taxes so they have more money to invest on the people's welfare. But that's, if you ask a average Chinese citizen, and that person would say it's bullshit, because I work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. I don't have enough money to support myself, and the money I paid for the taxes never returned to me. So if you ask the government to raise more taxes, it would never benefit myself. So I think this is a very important factor, is that when you think about the effectiveness of certain suggestions of economic policies, you really should take into the political institution into consideration. So I was wondering why this is a very average Chinese citizen would realize that is common sense. Why would it take so much time for economists to get attention of how important political institutions, the role they played in determining economy? So, and do you see this paper's influence would facilitate a paradigm shift in how we approach political economy or institutional economy?
Okay, so I think political economy always has been important, or the economics of politics is important, but it's typically difficult to prove, to find evidence for these mechanisms. So it's easy to have a story or to build on common knowledge. Then you get very flat, very obvious policy prescription, but in practice you need to find stronger evidence and more detailed evidence. What policies do really work? What institutions do really work? Is it okay to allow people to lease land, or do they really need to be the owner of the land with markets for land? These kind of detailed questions are the details that you need to solve as an economist. But of course, always in economics, there has been some attention for political role for the institutions. But I think these three researchers managed to build a kind of coherent story that is both based on very detailed data, on a new statistical method that says it must be that it's the settler mortality that established the institutions and therefore made things rich, because this is the order of time, right? This is how it went century by century. So the method, and finally, a bit of new theory. And it's also not that it's only these people who work. They stand on the shoulders of giants, other people who worked in the 50s about this, also spurred by the experiments in communist countries. And there is many follow-up researchers that even disprove the claims by these laureates. They say, no, it's culture. And they have they use the same methods that the laureates use, but to prove the opposite result, that culture sometimes does have a persistent effect.
Thank you for your interesting lecture. And yeah, I think I partly agree with these authors. But for me, as a student of international law, I think the international level of institutions was coming a little bit short.
Exactly.
And
you're right.
Yeah, I wanted to ask your opinion on the role of international law, because I think it's also an institution. And for example, investment law and how this regime also shapes the possibilities of countries all over the world, and to kind of develops this global north, global south distinction, but also like real institutions like WTO and how they are set up in a way to favor some countries, mostly Europe, US, and yeah, I think that these international institutions have nowadays a huge impact. So for me, it's a little bit short to say what happened in the past has now like perseverance until now, or we can only help them, support them. But I think that actually our current institutions still upheld this distinction between failing and succeeding.
Yeah, so you're right. The work of the laureates takes the country as the starting point, starts from sovereignty, and has little attention for international law, international institutions. But I think in principle you can apply the same methods, that at some point these institutions got into being. There should have been some initiating shock that started them, and then you need to check if there is sufficient support. Is it going to be reinforced, or is it going to be at the other side and it's going to be you attempt to improve the international institutions, but they go downhill because, again, it's not profitable, or it's not in the interest of some powerful countries. So maybe you can apply the same methods to explain this, but you're right, the book has little attention for this. That's kind of a gap.
So we have to see the comments coming days again on the value of this research and these books. Yep. So thank you very much, Sjak, for give us all the insights of this work of those 3 Nobel Prize winners. And thank you for coming all, and hope to see you after the Christmas and after the New Year and all the parties and so on. And have a good time tonight and coming up. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.